Shabbat Shalom. When I first decided to speak about the 2024 presidential election this Shabbat, I wasn't sure we would know the final outcome of the election. I am grateful that there will be a peaceful transition of power. I know we have a variety of feelings about the election, ranging from despair and numbness to jubilation and optimism. Though we are not a true purple congregation, because we lean heavily towards the Democratic Party, there are a significant number of Republicans at Shomrei, and our votes were cast both for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. So I will endeavor this morning to give an apolitical speech about one of the most important presidential elections in the history of the United States of America. Given how radically different, even mutually exclusive, the narratives are about the candidates and the significance of this election, I'm not sure it's possible to successfully thread the needle. But I will try, and I hope when you judge my words, you will consider not only what I am saying, but also what I am refraining from saying. This morning's Torah portion, Lech Lecha, begins the story of our forefather Abraham, still known in the beginning of the Parsha as Avram. It also happens to be the same Torah portion we read on Shabbat after the presidential election in 2016, when Donald Trump was first elected president of the United States. What stands out most to me this morning is that the founder of Judaism, Abraham, who was also the founder of Christianity and Islam, was called to take a journey to an unknown destination. God calls to Avram, Lech Lecha el haaretz asher areka. Go forth to a place that I will show you. Our commentators often focus on the hidden reasons Avram merited this call from God, but this morning I want to focus instead on the courage and the curiosity, the openness and the vigilance it took for Avram to go on a journey to an unknown destination. For the predictions of our future as Americans, as grim or triumphant as they may be, ultimately point to uncertainty about our future, which is by definition unknown. Our tradition understands God's command to Avram, Lech Lecha, to go forth to a journey to an unknown destination as a test, one of 10 tests of Abraham that he would encounter in his lifetime, the majority of which are in this morning's Torah reading. We too will be tested in the months and years ahead, both as Americans and as Jews. This morning I want to take a closer look at the concept of Abraham's 10 tests, which comes from Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers. With 10 trials was Abraham, our father, tested, and he withstood them all. The Mishnah doesn't specify what the 10 tests were, perhaps because the authors of the Mishnah thought it was obvious, or because they wanted to leave open the possibility that the tests would be defined differently by different people in different generations. Three famous medieval rabbis, Rashi from the 11th century France, Maimonides from the 12th century in Cordoba, and Bartanura from 15th century Italy, all formulate lists of Abraham's 10 trials. The tests themselves are mostly the same. Certainly, the binding of Isaac makes all three lists. But there are variances, both in terms of which moments are included as tests and how those moments are characterized. This invites us to each come up with our own list of the 10 trials ahead, and to revise our list as the events unfold. This morning, I will share my list of 10 possible trials ahead of us, based on Jewish values and Jewish history, not because I think it's the definitive list, but because I hope it will spark discussion and debate about the challenges that lie ahead. Taken from this week's Parsha, the first test is what I'll call the place that I will show you test. It's the challenge of living with an uncertain future. As a caring community, How can all of us, regardless of our political affiliation, acknowledge and support those among us who are experiencing disappointment, anxiety, and dread about the results of this election? How can compassionate listening and spiritual practices such as Shabbat support us as individuals and as a community at this time? And how can we remind ourselves that we still have agency to shape the future we want, if not at the governmental level, then at least at the communal level? The second test I'll call the Elu ve'elu test, based on a famous passage from the Talmud where opposing opinions of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai were called these and these, Elu ve'elu, were indicators of two legitimate paths. It points to a central value in the Talmud that we can disagree with each other without villainizing the other, that we can even strive to understand each other's points of view. In a country where a clear victory in a presidential election means that 50.5% of the people voted one way and 47.9% voted the other, we are divided almost evenly between two schools of thought in America. Within our own community and more broadly within our country, how can we endeavor to embody the value of Elu ve'elu and to better understand the point of view of those who we disagree with politically? The third test is the Niemöller test, named after Martin Niemöller, the German Lutheran pastor who opposed the Nazis and was famous for his poem, which opens, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I am not a socialist." Its closing words are, "Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." I am not an immigrant, and I am not a high-ranking political opponent of the government that will be in power. If the rhetoric becomes action and people are pursued who are innocent, people other than the Jews, we will be tested in whether or not we speak out. The Niemöller test is particularly poignant today, the 9th of November, the 86th anniversary of Kristallnacht. Test number 4 is the trans-ally test, based on our commitment at Shomrei to the values of human dignity and the teaching that every human being is created regardless of gender or sexual orientation, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. We demonstrate every Shabbat our support for gender inclusivity when we call people up to the Torah using the words Na la'amod, affirming our gender-neutral Hebrew language as a commitment to be an inclusive community for all Jews, regardless of identity or orientation. In response to increased fears in the LGBT community that their rights will be diminished by all branches of government in the years ahead, we will be tested as LGBT and trans allies. Test number 5, I call the Ki Gerim Hayitem B'Mitzrayim test, the test evoking the teaching from the Torah repeated 36 times that we should treat the stranger with compassion because we ourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. This builds on the Niemöller test. The because we were strangers test asks us to watch out for those who are most vulnerable in our society, not from a place of fear about what might happen to us, but from a place of compassion and empathy based on our historical experience as Jews. The Ki Gerim Hayitem test acknowledges the privileges and responsibilities we have, even as we too might feel vulnerable as Jews in a time of increasing anti-Semitism. Test number 6, there shall be no needy. This test comes from a famous passage in the book of Deuteronomy. First we read, there shall be no needy, establishing an ideal that there won't be anyone who cannot afford the basics of housing, food, and healthcare. But then just a few verses later, the Torah says, if, however, there is a needy person among you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kin. Rather, you shall open your hand and lend what is ever sufficient to their need. Clearly, the economy, was one driving force behind this election. And there are millions of fellow Americans who are struggling to make ends meet in a time when the cost of groceries and housing has risen so dramatically. As a community of giving, one test will be our continued resolve to help those in our local community face food and housing insecurity. Test number 7, I'm calling the Hagar and Ishmael test. Inspired by Maimonides' version of the 10 tests of Abraham. Living in Cordoba under Muslim rule, Maimonides was not only immersed in Arab culture and thought, but inspired by it. Strikingly, his list of 10 tests included not only the tests of sending Hagar and Ishmael away, which is on all the lists, but also 2 tests that were not otherwise mentioned, the test of marrying Hagar and the test of becoming estranged from his son Ishmael. We are living in a precarious time where Israel is still at war 400 days after the October 7th attacks. Whether one administration or another is better for Israel is a matter of debate. But if President Trump gives Prime Minister Netanyahu unfettered support, given Netanyahu's current far-right coalition, the impact on Palestinian civilians could be devastating. The Hagar and Ishmael tests asks us to have compassion for Palestinian women and children, even in a time of war. Test number 8 is the truth test. The famous saying, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it, is often attributed to Goebbels, the famous Nazi propagandist. We are living in a time when it is exhausting to debunk every mistruth and conspiracy theory and lie in politics, especially in the echo chambers of the social media web. And yet when lies dehumanize our neighbors, we must speak up. The word emet, or truth, is a key attribute of God throughout our Shabbat morning prayers, an attribute we are asked to live up in our personal and in our political lives. I'm calling test number 9 the Dugma test, or the lead by example test. From Moses through the Talmud to today, including Abraham, there is an idea in Judaism that our leaders should exemplify the highest qualities we aspire to emulate as human beings, even if they're not perfect. And that is not only in their public lives, but also in their private lives. Moses was the greatest prophet who ever lived because of his humility. And the Talmud is full of stories about the actions of rabbis because the example they set in their lives was as important as their teachings and the positions of power that they held. The Dugma, lead by example test, is one of choosing which examples to follow and which ones not to follow, and of being our own examples of what is good and just for our community and for our children. Finally, test number 10 is inspired by a test I would argue Abraham passed that somehow wasn't included on any of the official lists. When Abraham saw that God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he argued with God, challenging his actions. It was in this moment that Abraham became our first prophet. We have elected officials at all levels of government, local, state, and national, who need to hear our voices if and when we disagree with their policies and their actions. That is the prophecy test. These 10 tests I have suggested, inspired by Abraham's 10 tests and based on our Jewish values and historical experience, are intended simply to get the conversation started. What do you think are the tests that we'll encounter in the journey ahead after this election? How will we recognize them? And what tools will we use to face them? How will we be tested individually and collectively as Jews and as Americans? And how can we work together as a community despite our diverse political views to build a future that upholds our highest ideals? May we be spared from the worst tests we fear. And may we have the fortitude and the strength to face the trials ahead. Shabbat Shalom, and God bless America.